There are stories that history writes in books, and stories it hides in filing cabinets. In a quiet wing of the Library of Congress, thousands of pages sit untouched. Not novels, not official reports, but the recorded memories of Americans who lived before the modern world took shape. They are not audio recordings, they are transcripts, handwritten recollections captured by government writers who were told to preserve something fragile, memory itself. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? Country, city, anywhere in the world. I always want to know how far these forgotten stories travel. In the late 1930s, during the economic crisis that reshaped the United States, the government launched an unusual program. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his sweeping New Deal, writers, journalists, and researchers who had lost their jobs were hired for a different mission. This effort became the Federal Writers Project. Their instructions were simple but urgent. Find the oldest Americans still alive. Sit with them. Write down what they remember. Between 1936 and 1940, these writers collected nearly 3,000 life histories from people across 24 states. Farmers, former soldiers, freed slaves, factory workers, widows, migrants, ordinary people whose lives spanned the 19th century into the industrial age. Then something strange happened. The project ended abruptly. The interviews were boxed up, and for decades, almost no one read them. I discovered them while researching something else entirely. I had been studying courthouse blueprints from the 1870s, trying to understand why many public buildings from that era seem oversized, almost out of proportion with the communities they served. But the more I followed those architectural trails, the more I realized the real mystery wasn't the buildings. It was the people who remembered them. Because the math tells a remarkable story. Someone born in 1855 and living into their 80s, a normal lifespan for that era, would still have been alive when the WPA interviewers arrived at their door. That means the government unknowingly captured testimony from individuals who remembered a United States before railroads dominated, before electricity spread, before modern cities took their present shape. They were children during one of the most chaotic transitions in American history. And what they described doesn't always match what we were taught. Take October 8, 1871. Most Americans know it as the night of the Great Chicago Fire, the legend of a lantern in a barn, a wooden city reduced to ash, a tragedy followed by rebuilding. But the same night, another disaster unfolded hundreds of miles away. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm swept through the town with terrifying speed. Within hours, thousands were dead. Survivors described winds so violent they lifted people from the ground, and heat so intense that open air itself felt deadly. The event became the deadliest wildfire in American history, yet it rarely occupies more than a footnote in textbooks. The fires did not stop there. Communities across Michigan burned that same evening. Entire regions of the upper Midwest reported flames breaking out almost simultaneously. The official explanation blamed drought, logging debris, and strong winds, reasonable causes on their own. But the timing has puzzled observers ever since. Now consider this. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s had grown up hearing about that night from parents who lived through it. Some remembered the glow in the sky. Others recalled stories passed down at family tables, warnings, fears, details that never entered official reports. Their memories were captured on paper. Then the papers were filed away. What else did those witnesses remember? What stories did they tell that never made it into history books? And why did the government stop recording them just as those memories became most valuable? Because when we follow the trail from those interviews, we begin to see that the fires of 1871 were only the beginning of a much larger pattern. And that pattern leads directly to the question at the center of this story. What exactly did the last Americans who remembered the old world try to tell us before they were gone? If the interviews preserved the voices of the past, then the census should have preserved their identities. In 1890, the United States conducted what historians consider the most detailed population count the country had ever attempted. Unlike earlier counts, which recorded little more than names and numbers, this census asked deeper questions: birthplace, immigration status, language ability, military service, employment, family structure. It captured a snapshot of nearly 63 million Americans, a complete picture of the nation at the exact moment it was transforming from a rural republic into an industrial power. And then, it disappeared. For the first time in American history, the census records were stored in only one place, a government building in Washington, under the authority of the United States Census Bureau, Earlier censuses had always been copied and distributed to local courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census broke that tradition. There was no backup. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in the basement where the records were kept. When firefighters arrived, they found smoke pouring from the building. Some documents burned immediately. Others were soaked in water, warped, and scattered. But here's the unsettling part. Roughly half of the census survived. It was damaged, yes, but not destroyed. Archivists later noted that large portions could still have been restored or copied. Instead, the surviving records were packed into crates and moved to storage. For over a decade, nothing happened. No restoration, no duplication, no urgent effort to preserve what remained. Then, in December 1932, a quiet bureaucratic decision changed everything. Officials proposed that the damaged census be formally destroyed. The request was sent to the Library of Congress for review. A librarian was asked to identify any portions worth saving for historical purposes. His response was brief: none. Congress approved the destruction in early 1933. The timing is what makes historians uneasy, because the very next day construction began on the National Archives, a fireproof facility designed specifically to prevent the loss of government records. The building that would have protected the census was started one day after the census was eliminated. Of the nearly 63 million names recorded in 1890, only fragments remain today. Roughly 6,000 individual records survive by chance, tiny scraps of a national portrait that once existed in full. This matters more than it first appears. That census documented the exact generation who lived through the upheavals of the late 19th century, the same generation whose memories were later recorded by WPA writers. Without the census, their connections become harder to trace. Families lose links to ancestors. Migration patterns blur. Entire communities fade into statistical shadows. It's as if the country's most important demographic record was erased at precisely the moment it became historically crucial. And the census wasn't the only place where identities seemed to dissolve. Between the 1850s and the early 20th century, thousands of children were transported westward on what became known as the orphan train movement, organized primarily by the Children's Aid Society, founded by Charles Loring Brace. These trains carried children from crowded eastern cities to rural towns across the Midwest. Officially, the program aimed to rescue orphans and place them with families. In reality, many of the children were not orphans at all. They were the sons and daughters of immigrants, the poor, or the displaced, children whose families simply couldn't support them. When they arrived in their new communities, records were often incomplete. Names changed. Birthplaces vanished. Some children grew up never knowing where they came from. By the program's end, roughly 250,000 American children had been relocated, their identities partially rewritten. So by the early 20th century, something unusual had happened. The most detailed census was gone. Hundreds of thousands of identities were blurred or altered, and the last living witnesses to the previous century were aging rapidly, which raises a question that historians rarely ask aloud. Was all of this coincidence? Or was the country quietly losing track of its own past? Because once identities vanish, memories become the only remaining evidence. And those memories were sitting in filing cabinets waiting to be read. By the early 1890s, America was changing fast. Railroads stitched the continent together. Factories multiplied. Cities expanded upward and outward. But in 1893, something happened in Chicago that seemed almost out of step with the country's reality. In just 2 years, workers constructed what newspapers called a dream city, a vast exhibition of gleaming white buildings, towering domes, grand colonnades, and sculpted facades. It stretched across hundreds of acres in Jackson Park and attracted millions of visitors from around the world. It was officially known as the World's Columbian Exposition, built to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. But to those who walked through it, the place felt less like a temporary fair and more like a civilization. They called it the White City. Visitors described monumental halls larger than anything most Americans had ever seen. Buildings modeled on classical European architecture stood in perfect symmetry. Electric lights illuminated the grounds at night, casting reflections across artificial lagoons and marble-like surfaces. And yet, almost all of it was meant to be temporary. According to official records, these enormous structures were constructed using wooden frames covered in plaster and fiber-based materials, designed to look permanent but built to last only months. Horses hauled materials. Workers used hand tools, and somehow, within 2 years, over 200 grand buildings rose from open land. Then, within a few years, most of them were gone. Fires destroyed some. Demolition crews dismantled others. By the early 20th century, nearly the entire White City had vanished. Only one major structure endured, the Palace of Fine Arts, preserved because it had been built with fireproof materials to protect its exhibits. Today, that building survives as the Museum of Science and Industry. Everything else became memory. For many Americans, the fair was simply an impressive event. But for the elderly citizens interviewed decades later by WPA writers, the White City triggered a different reaction. Some said the buildings felt older than the country itself. They spoke of proportions that reminded them of structures they had seen in their childhood: courthouses, civic buildings, train stations, grand spaces built at a scale that seemed to belong to another era. A few described the fair not as something entirely new, but as something strangely familiar, like a reflection of a world already fading. It's difficult to know how much of this was nostalgia and how much was observation. Memory is rarely precise, but what makes their testimony interesting is the timing. The White City rose only 2 decades after the great fires of the 1870s had destroyed large portions of the Midwest. It appeared during the same generation whose identities were documented in the vanished census, and it was witnessed by the same people whose oral histories were being recorded by government writers in the 1930s. To them, the fair marked a turning point. After 1893, architecture in many American cities began shifting towards simpler, more utilitarian forms. Ornamentation declined. Classical symmetry gave way to practical construction. It was as if the nation had briefly recreated a monumental past, then chosen not to continue it, or perhaps could not. By the time those elderly witnesses told their stories, the White City had become something almost mythical, a place remembered through photographs, postcards, and fading recollections. A city that existed long enough for millions to see it, but not long enough to remain part of daily life. And when historians later reconstructed the event, they focused on innovation, culture, and industry. But the witnesses remembered something else. They remembered walking through a city that seemed larger than its moment in time. A place that looked ancient, even though it had just been built. A place that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Which leads to the deeper question beneath all of this. Why did so many of the grandest structures of the 19th century vanish so quickly, while the memories of those who saw them lingered for decades? Because if the buildings were temporary, the impressions they left were not. And those impressions were carried by the last Americans who remembered a different world, a world that by the mid-20th century was already slipping beyond reach. By the 1940s and early 1950s, the generation that remembered the 19th century firsthand was almost gone. They were the last Americans who had grown up before automobiles filled the streets, before radio connected the country, before the skyline replaced the horizon. Many of them had been interviewed years earlier through the Federal Writers Project, whose transcripts were eventually stored in the Library of Congress. But thousands more were never interviewed. Their stories didn't end up in archives. They lived instead in living rooms, on porches, and around kitchen tables, passed quietly to children and grandchildren. And by the time America entered the post-war era, those stories had begun to sound out of place. Imagine a woman born in 1858. By 1950, she would be in her 90s. She would remember a childhood without electricity, a town built mostly of wood, and streets lit by lamps instead of neon. She would remember when buildings seemed larger, when towns felt more deliberate, when the rhythm of life moved slower but somehow felt more permanent. She might remember the night the sky turned red in the distance. She might remember fairs, expositions, or civic buildings that no longer existed. She might recall trains full of children heading west, or neighbors who disappeared after fires and never returned. To her grandchildren, those stories sounded distant and almost unreal, not because they were impossible, but because they didn't match what schoolbooks described. By the mid-20th century, history had already been streamlined into clean narratives: industrial progress, urban growth, national expansion. The messy details, the contradictions, the uncertainties of lived memory rarely fit neatly into those summaries. And so many families did what families often do when stories become uncomfortable or confusing. They listened politely, then moved on. The elderly spoke, the young nodded, and the memories slowly faded into silence. Meanwhile, institutions focused on preserving official records. In 1935, construction began on the National Archives building, a massive structure designed to safeguard federal documents from the kinds of losses that had destroyed earlier records. The intention was preservation, but preservation only works for what gets recorded. Oral history is fragile. It exists only as long as someone remembers, and someone else cares enough to write it down. By the early 1950s, many of those elderly Americans died within a short span of years. Some passed quietly in their homes, others in hospitals that now looked nothing like the places where they had been born. Their grandchildren inherited photographs, furniture, and family Bibles. But the stories, those often vanished with them, not because anyone intended to erase them, but because daily life rarely pauses long enough to capture memories before they disappear. And this is where the archive becomes haunting, because inside those WPA transcripts, preserved on aging paper and microfilm, we can still hear fragments of voices describing a country in transition, a nation that seemed to shift dramatically within a single lifetime. They speak of towns rebuilt after fires, of buildings that once seemed larger than life, of social customs and physical spaces that felt older than the generation living in them. None of it reads like conspiracy. It reads like memory. And memory is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, personal, observational, which makes it easy to ignore. By the time television entered American homes in the 1950s, the last living witnesses to that earlier world were disappearing. Their stories became family lore instead of public record. And with their passing, the bridge between the 19th century and the modern era quietly collapsed, not in flames, not through deliberate destruction, but through the simple, unstoppable passage of time. Because history doesn't only vanish when records burn. Sometimes it vanishes when the last person who remembers stops speaking. Here is Chapter 5, approximately equal to 600 words, the closing chapter with a reflective ending and a natural subscribe prompt for the dark past. Chapter 5, What the Archive Still Knows. There is a strange illusion we carry about history. We think the past disappears, that once a generation dies, its world dies with it. But that isn't entirely true, because sometimes the past lingers, not in monuments or textbooks, but in quiet places where almost no one looks anymore. Boxes, folders, transcripts. Inside the Library of Congress, thousands of pages still sit in climate-controlled silence. Pages filled with the words of Americans who lived through the 19th century and spoke about it decades later, when the world already felt unfamiliar to them. They didn't speak like historians. They spoke like witnesses. They described towns that no longer existed, buildings that seemed older than their own grandparents, fires that erased entire landscapes overnight, children sent west with no names and no past. They spoke about a world that felt closer to the frontier than to the modern nation their grandchildren inherited. And what makes their testimony powerful is not mystery or drama. It's the ordinary tone of it. These were not people trying to rewrite history. They were simply telling stories about the lives they remembered. A house that once stood at the end of a road. A fair that seemed impossibly grand. A night when the sky glowed red beyond the hills. Individually, each memory sounds small, but together they form something else. A reminder that history is not just what governments publish or what schools teach. History is also what people experience and what they pass down imperfectly through memory. And memory fades, not because it is erased, but because time moves forward faster than stories can travel. By the mid-20th century, America was looking ahead. Highways replaced railroads. Cities stretched upward instead of outward. Television replaced the front porch as the center of conversation. The world those elderly witnesses described felt distant, almost mythic, even though it had existed only decades earlier. And so their stories were placed in archives, where they waited, not hidden, just forgotten. Which raises a quiet question. What else sits in those archives, waiting for someone patient enough to read it? Because sometimes the truth about the past isn't buried. It's cataloged, filed, labeled, and left alone. Not because anyone wants to hide it, but because most people assume the official version is enough. But history is rarely that simple. It lives in the gaps between records, in the contradictions between memory and documentation, in the voices that spoke once and were never asked again. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that history was erased, but that understanding the past requires curiosity, the willingness to look beyond summaries and listen to the people who actually lived it. Because the last Americans who remembered that earlier world are gone now. Their grandchildren are nearly gone too. but their words remain, waiting in archives, waiting in letters, waiting in family stories told once and never written down again. So the question isn't whether the past survives, it's whether we care enough to listen when it does. If you found this video thought-provoking, consider supporting our channel, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what piece of history do you think we still don't fully understand? Because sometimes the next story begins with a single unanswered question.